Good evening. It's 6:05 p.m. We are 5 minutes of my grace time, office hours, 6 p.m. Tuesday, October 10th, 2023, Econ 330, Medgar Evers College. Econ 330, of course, is global business and political economy. I welcome everyone. As you know, 2 weeks ago, we began a three-part study of the three theoretical perspectives of global trade. Just to recap, those, of course, include one, the liberal perspective, two, the realistic perspective, the realistic perspective, and three, historical materialism. Obviously, 2 weeks ago, we covered the liberal perspective. Last week, we covered the realistic perspective, and this week, the historical materialism perspective. As we discussed in previous weeks, the main common feature of the group of critical perspectives is that they are all critical of traditional, mainstream, liberal, and realist perspective. While we will touch on several critical perspectives, we will devote more attention to historical materialism, the Marxist, than the other critical perspectives because it encompasses the largest group of critical theories, including Marxism, dependency theory, wall system theory, and Gramscian analysis. Although all these approaches have some root in Marxism, they often diverge substantially from classical Marxist thoughts. Historical materialism is historical because it examines the structural change in terms of class and sometimes the North-South struggle over time. And it is materialist because it examines the role of material, especially economic factors in shaping society. Of course, in previous weeks, especially 4 weeks ago, when we discussed the IMF, we had a broad conversation, and some of it was actually fairly detailed on the North-South divide in terms of classification of economic performance and other political structures that underpin global political economy. So the learning objectives is that upon completion of this module, you will be able to explain how the Marxist school of thought perceives global trade, right? So in thinking through how the Marxian school of thought perceives global trade, it's important to note that Marxian school of thought on global trade relations perceives produced exchange value as inseparable from the creation of surplus profit through exploitation of surplus labor. So I'll say that again. The Marxian school of thought on global trade relations perceives produced exchange value as inseparable from the creation of surplus profit through exploitation of surplus labor. And we will get to really unpack this as we go along. It considers global trade relations as an inherently unequal exchange. The Marxian narrative fits into the phenomena of colonial trade between developed and underdeveloped countries, as well as exchange of production between underdeveloped societies. More broadly, the Marxian narrative considers global trade relations as not the clash of interest and power, as, of course, would be posited by the realistic perspective. But rather a reflection of global mode of production and the ensuing relationship of production among nations. So the Marxian narrative considers global trade relations as not a clash of interest and power, but rather a reflection of global mode of production and ensuring relation of production among nations. And we will get to, again, delve deeper into all this and get to unpack it some more. So the second part that you should be able to have down pat at the end of this, your assessment for this week, is ability to describe and explain global trade relations from the perspective of new Gramscian theory, and to be able to provide examples of dependency theory of global trade. In this way, the new Gramscian approach does not consider the realist school of thought and the liberal theories as mutually exclusive, but rather consider the very theoretical foundations of the two schools of thought as mutually reinforcing, with interlocking relationship between agency and structure. So as you may recall, the liberal perspective supports the primacy and significance of global institutions, which was why we had a foundational class on the role and distinctions between the United Nations as an example, the World Trade Organization as another example, the World Bank, to give you another example, and of course, the International Monetary Fund, among others. We also mentioned the BRICS Bank, of course, as another emerging institutional lender. So that would be the institutions that the liberal order would see as necessary for refereeing and setting the ground rules for global commerce. And the United Nations being, of course, part of the dispute resolution mechanism. And of course, the World Trade Organization also having a dispute resolution mechanism. Of course, as we also discussed, the World Trade Organization builds on GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, by including, among others, trade in intellectual property and trade in service. So, and this, of course, contrasts with the with the Marxist school of thought that reinforces the idea that nation states are advancing the core interest of their countries, right? And that nation states have supremacy, the core interest of nation states. Of course, if you will recall, last week I detailed how when countries react without consideration for international institutions and norms and the global order, that it can sometimes create a counter action from other countries that can exacerbate the very challenges that they are looking to forestall. One example that I gave was Russia's position that NATO was expanding and that it needed to invade Ukraine to create a buffer state between itself and NATO countries. Of course, what has since happened is that Finland has joined NATO, and Norway is about to ascend into NATO as well. And of course, Ukraine continues to actively and stiffly resist the Russian invasion. So I pointed that to be some of the folly that indeed their reaction may actually exacerbate the very challenges that the nation state who is acting without respect to international norms may indeed occasion. So again, the neo-Gramscian approach does not consider the realist school of thought, which is of course the realist school of thought is what I just explained, and the liberal theories as mutually exclusive. And so the neo-Gramscian approach splits the difference between the two, and it thinks that both are factors. In the neo-Gramscian approach as an example. A class or nation state, so class is within society, and nation state obviously is country to country. A class, in terms, and you will see why there was a mention of a class within a nation state, or a nation state cannot dominate in modern conditions by merely advancing its own narrow economic interest. And neither can it dominate purely through force and coercion. Rather, it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises with a variety of forces. So let's really repeat, let me try to repeat myself, and let's see if we can unpack this a little bit to see what it truly suggests. In neo-Gramscian approach, a class or nation state cannot dominate in modern conditions by merely advancing its own narrow economic interest, and neither can it dominate purely through force or coercion. Rather, it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises with a variety of forces. So we can begin to see how this is manifesting in today's global political economy. To reemphasize a commitment that I made is not to make this class abstract, but rather to draw a linkage, a direct line between topics that we cover in the class and current events. Going back again to the Russian example. So Russia's economic interest in creating a hegemony with the absence of intellectual and moral leadership has begun to undermine its traditional sphere of influence. And I'm thinking about what's the associations between Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and all the other former Central Asian Soviet republics, who are now creating a gas pipeline that avoids Russia altogether and that links directly to China. And there appears to be a competition of who the hegemon would be in that region. And contrast that with China's Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. And this is without bias to some of the criticisms that has been leveled against the BRI. What it at least attempts to do is have intellectual and moral leadership, by which it has a theory of growth and development that it's advancing in the global community. And that the BRI also has become a mechanism at best to forge alliances. And of course, China is also learning very quickly that they must also make compromises with a variety of forces. Some might argue not enough compromise, and there has been an over-reliance on brute force than compromise. But for the countries that China has restructured that debt that emanated from BRI projects, that would suggest at least a level of compromise. So obviously, the other part of the learning outcome is to be able to demonstrate examples of the dependency theory. Examples of dependency theory of global trade relations include, again, the aforementioned China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. Although it has been accused by many institutions in the West as creating a debt trap and therefore dependency. I should also note that some in this class have also argued, and that is a view that exists out there that enjoys a measure of support. That, and again, this is not speaking to the veracity of the claims against the BRI, or in this case, the IMF, that some in this case, some in this class and others in the global community have made that the IMF facilities also create a dependency relationship. And that IMF is a typical example of a Western institution that creates dependencies. So, however you look at it, a non-performing loan can create dependency. And as I think I mentioned in 3 classes ago, there are endogenous factors within nation states that international institutions simply lack the tool and the scope to influence. And as has been said sometimes, culture can often trump the best policy. But without getting too sidetracked, here's another example of dependency theory of global trade relations. Is the active extraction of resources from less industrialized or periphery countries for the benefit of the highly industrialized, wealthy core countries. So I'll repeat that again. The active extraction of resources from less industrialized, poor periphery countries for the benefit of the highly industrialized, wealthy, poor countries. In this way, the world is polarized into 2, the patron, highly industrialized, wealthy core, and the dependent, less industrialized, poor peripheries nations. So notice that many of the extractive industries, or at least the resources that the world runs on, much of them is extracted from the global south, and which is the region where most of the less industrialized countries are located. And of course, most of the value chain and therefore the economic beneficiation from translating these raw materials into consumer products and services occur in the West, and most of the consumption also occur in the West. I am thinking as an example, traditionally, the oil and gas sector, where if you were to take a look at OPEC countries, with the exception of Russia, which for purposes of economic classification, it's really on its own, not the traditional North, and again, obviously not in the global South. There's also another outlier, which is a non-OPEC country, China, which increasingly is a manufacturing capital of the world. But setting aside those 2 outliers, many of the resources that the world runs on, they are extracted in the global South. Most of them, the real value chain in the processing to finished consumer products occur in the West, and the main consumers are in the West. So this creates a dependency where, of course, the West controls the institutions or the multinationals that extract these resources. And of course, some would argue many of the global institutions that also referee global trade. The theory would also argue that the periphery countries are poor, as I was beginning to advance, are poor because they are forcefully integrated into the international division of labor, where they principally function as suppliers of raw material or repertoire for cheap labor, or repositories for cheap labor. This resource diversification is typically maintained through active collaboration of local elites. And remember, initially I had said that there was a clear distinction that it has in the neo-Gramscian approach, a class or nation state. So there is a class of the elite that a neo-Gramscian approach would argue are in the periphery countries that work in concert with, or the elite that work in concert with dominant states who share common interests to maintain this imbalance in distribution. So again, to the extent that the global north is exerting its force or its economic power and technology superiority to maintain this economic balance, it also maintains global institutions that underpin the rules of engagement, thereby striking that balance. So at the end of this week also, obviously, you should be able to argue why global trade relations may be exploitative of developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America as examples. What is important to note in this regard, I think, is and at some point in the coming weeks, we're going to touch on this a little bit. The institutions within nation states, which can also conspire with the imbalances to the extent that to whatever extent in the global order, to undermine the competitiveness of the global South. So you ought to be able to argue why the global trade relations may be exploitative. And again, it's okay to take a position one way or the other to think that it's perfectly okay, that it's not exploitative, that indeed that global, to the extent that natural resources are mined in the global South, that it by necessity makes the global South part of the global supply chain. Obviously, the nature of the activities in the global South and the level of economic beneficiation for the local countries where these resources are mined can also speak volumes to whether the relationship is fair, exploitative, or balanced. So these are some of the weighty issues that we've tried to cover over the past 3 weeks, especially. So as you go through your assessments for the week, let me be the first to congratulate you for your effort and for successful completion by the end of this week of your first 7 weeks and module 7 of Economic 330, Global Business and Political Economy. So with our studies over the past 3 weeks, by the end of this office hour, you should again be able to identify at least 3 critical ideological perspectives of global trade and political economy, explain the philosophical differences between the critical perspective, the liberal perspective, and the realistic perspective, describe the differences between various critical perspectives. And again, foreshadowing next week's class, we are going to focus on international monetary relations. And let me just very briefly mention why that is so critical, the international monetary relations. It is critical because trade finance is expensive. It is a barrier to competitiveness. Indeed, within domestic economies and international economies, the ability to finance trade is critical to the competitiveness of industries and nation states. And you would hear, and I think we did touch on this a little bit about allotments in the IMF and how that can affect the levels of financing a country is eligible to, and how that can influence their economic productivity and competitiveness. So I also want to acknowledge Katie, and I also want to acknowledge Mahek. And while I'm acknowledging the both of you, I want to know if you have any questions of me.
No, I don't have any questions, Professor. Not today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mahek? Or Mihak?
Yes, sir.
So if you don't mind, could you again correct me and tell me what the correct pronunciation for your name is?
It's Mehek.
Mehek. Okay, so Mehek, would you have any questions for me?
No, sir.
Okay,
I don't have any
and
questions.
excellent. So I'm going to assume that and make a wild assumption to mean that I've done a pretty good job explaining today's uh, assessments.
Mhm.
Yes.
Are
Oh,
there
well, I
any?
do have a question.
Please go
So
ahead.
is it important to join the office hour meeting like this one?
So I highly encourage it, and here is why. First, people learn differently. Some people learn better by listening. Others learn by reading or watching and observing. But attending office hours allows you the benefit of both perspectives. And it, of course, creates a dynamic, instantaneous conversation where you're able to ask questions and I'm able to offer a response immediately and contextual response because, of course, this is not email. And if the response is not exactly one that you're seeking, of course, we can deep dive the question a little bit more. So I highly encourage it. It's advantageous and it also suggests a level of engagement with the class.
Right, because I have classes in person on Tuesdays.
Okay.
Yeah, so it ends by like 6:10. So I will be at in the train during the this section. So I won't be able
Okay.
to join because the train goes underground and the
Mm-hmm.
signal loss. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's hard to join the class. So I do watch your recording though.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And if it's okay with you, if you don't mind, if you could just drop me just a short email letting me know again about this conflict and otherwise your interest in attending and that you watch the video just for records that way I'll have it as well.
Okay,
Okay.
so I should email you, right?
Yeah, just a brief email can be just one line. Hey,
Oh,
Prof, as I mentioned, I have a class that conflicts with office hours. It ends at 6:10, and soon after which I'm in the train, which is underground. I'm unable to have internet connection. But I
okay,
do
sounds good.
follow up on video, yes.
I'll do it. Thank you.
Excellent. So without the benefit of questions, I would consider this week's office hour concluded. And again, I wish everyone good luck on your assessments. And as always, please be mindful of the submission deadline. Be well and take care.
You too. Bye
Thank you,
bye.
Professor. Have a great evening.
All right, good evening.
Bye. Take care.